Well, we are in week 2 of our Lent series, and I don't know about you, but I could not have scripted a better beginning to Lent than what we experienced last week. We didn't do the hard math on this, but from the number of people who were here on Ash Wednesday and Sunday, about 75% of you responded to the invitation to lay down your ashes, to release the broken parts of your life to God, to bring beauty and new life. And that is so exciting to me. This isn't just pastor talk, because I know sometimes we like to say things that sound good, but we don't really believe. I really believe this. I believe that step of surrender that so many of you took, that might be the most important next right step you ever take in your life. I really believe that, because I know that some of us have been carrying a lot of stuff for way too long, and we don't have to. And so I'm excited to hear and see what God is going to bring out of that. And for some of us, that letting go, it was a no-brainer. I mean, you might have even sensed before you came to church that He's going to call me to let something go today. I mean, you knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was the end of the road for that thing that you were letting go. But for others, that was a huge step of faith, because if for no other reason than it had been a part of you for so long, it feels like you've given up a part of your identity. But my prayer is that regardless of where we fall on that kind of spectrum of response, that as we've journeyed this first week or so, that those ashes have had they've had the intended purpose, that as we've seen them, we've been reminded that what they represent does not belong to you anymore. It belongs to God. And while surrender is a vitally important next right step, and I want to make a comment. You did not think that I would preach a sermon series with journey in the title without incessantly using the phrase next right step. And again, if you want to blame somebody, Dennis Owens. So that's, I learned well. But while it's a vitally important next right step, the reality is it's just that. It's a step. It's just the first of a bunch of next right steps that we have to take in life if we're going to stay surrendered and live free of what we've given to God. Another way of saying it would be surrender is the first step in a journey, and that journey is one of trust. Now that we've let those ashes go, now that we've let those things go, can we trust God with what's left and what's next? Because the reality is, once we have surrendered something to God, or maybe we'll put a more positive angle on this, once we have been set free from something, once God has set us free from something, things change. Life is different, and life might feel better, and it's better, but it's still something that there's a change. There's something you have to get used to. And for some people, like I said, we've carried these things for so long, it's like you're entering this whole new phase of life where it's just full of uncertainty. I don't know what it is to live on the other side of this. I don't know what's around the corner. And we would love to have clarity. We would love to have a solid plan or a map or a GPS that tells us every twist and turn and every pothole and every detour that we're going to have to take. But I mean, we all know that life, and even the Christian life, does not always work that way. And it's in these moments that we have a choice to make. Are we going to try to take control of what we've let go? Or are we going to trust God? Are we going to rely on our own understanding and wisdom to chart our path? Or are we going to lean into the one who knows the bigger picture? And he knows the beginning from the end, because he is the beginning and the end. Because letting go isn't ever easy, is it? And just like we talked about last week, we like to feel in control and we like to have a handle on things, even though deep down inside we know that that thing probably had more control over us than we had of it. And the longer we held on to it, we didn't feel peace, we just felt more anxious and exhausted. But trust, on the other hand, even though it's seldom easier and it often requires more of us, ultimately is going to result in peace. And it doesn't result in peace because we get all the answers figured out or we know we have all of this stuff together, but because we know the one who does. That's what the journey of trust is. That's what the heart of the Lent journey is about. It's an invitation to kind of enter into that tension and that struggle between letting go of our need for control and trusting that God is not only in charge, but he's good. Even when we can't see how it fits together. And Lent also reminds us that the uncertainty that we experience in following God is not the same thing as not having anything to go on. God gives us plenty of stuff to go on. And in fact, he doesn't just give us stuff to go on. He goes with us himself. He provides, he sustains, he transforms, he carries us when we can't take another step. He doesn't ask us to have it all figured out because he knows we're never going to get it all figured out. He just asks that we trust him one next right step at a time. As Oswald Chambers put it, and you will probably hear me quote him a couple times in this series, he says, faith never knows where it is being led, but it loves and knows the one who's leading. That's what this journey is all about. And that struggle between staying surrendered and trusting God in the unknown is something that all of us who follow Jesus are going to have to deal with at some point. We want certainty, we want security, and yet the truth is trusting God often means letting go of control and embracing uncertainty. We're not always going to know every step ahead of time, but we do know the God who is leading us. We know that he knows and that he's faithful even when the way ahead is unclear. And one of the best examples of this tension of trust and surrender in the Bible is the story of the Israelites in the wilderness. When we catch up with them in Exodus 16, they have just experienced, just to call them miraculous is an understatement. They've been set free from their slavery in Egypt that they had experienced for centuries. And God led them out through some pretty jaw-dropping miracles. Plagues, parting the Red Sea, defeating Pharaoh's army. They had seen and experienced God's power firsthand in ways that most of us can't even begin to fathom. And then they hit the wilderness. And here's the thing about the wilderness. We kind of talked about this last week. Adam and Eve in the garden had everything, literally everything. Jesus in the wilderness had nothing. That's the wilderness. The wilderness it's a place where everything is stripped away. There aren't any creature comforts. There's no guarantees. There's nothing familiar to hold on to. It's just you, the wide open space, and your trust in God. And for the Israelites, if it hadn't already, it was about to get real. And the people start grumbling. Now, what we read in chapter 16 is not the first time that they've grumbled. Chapter 15, they've already started the process. But in chapter 16, the moment they face hunger, they have all of these memories of Egypt that start flooding back. And they're very stylized and idealized memories of Egypt. And verses 2 and 3 of chapter 16 kind of capture the essence of their complaint. It says, there too, the whole community of Israel complained about Moses and Aaron. If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But now you brought us into this wilderness to starve us all to death. Man, what an ungrateful But that sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? I mean, how often when things get tough in our lives, especially when we've entered into something new, when we've gotten on the other side of something, that we start to romanticize what used to be. Even if it wasn't great, because at least it was familiar. When we're in seasons of discomfort and uncertainty, it's easy to forget the lessons of our past struggles. It's easy to forget what God has brought us through. And we start to wish that we could go back to a time where, yes, it wasn't ideal, and in some cases it might have even been bad, but at least I knew what to expect. And we begin to seek refuge in the familiarity of what we knew, even if we know that it means going back to something that is not God's best for us. That's where the Israelites find themselves in the wilderness. And the reason they're finding themselves is because they're missing the big picture. They're forgetting all of the promises that God had given, all the way back to Abraham. I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to bless the world through you. They had lost sight of that. They didn't realize that God didn't lead them into the wilderness to abandon them. He had a purpose for them. If he just wanted to get rid of them, he would have left them in Egypt for the Egyptians to do whatever they wanted to with them. But he's got a purpose. Unfortunately, though, they've got to go through this season where they've got to learn to trust him. But they struggled to see that. In their minds, the uncertainty of the wilderness was worse than the certainty of slavery. So they grumbled. And that is so familiar to me, because that's me. And what strikes me about this story, and one of the reasons that is so familiar to me, is because their response to that is not the thing that strikes me about this story. The thing that strikes me about this story is God's response to the grumbling. You know, if dads, you can relate to me on this. If it was us and we were driving, we would look at the kids and go, we're turning this car around, we're going back to Egypt. God doesn't do that. Yes, he was sorrowful. His heart was, like any loving father, his heart was broken. And there was discipline that they would have to go through. But he's still going to lead them. And you know how he responds? With patience and provision. In Exodus 16:4, God says to Moses, look, I'm going to rain down food from heaven. Each day the people they need to go out, they need to pick up as much food as they can gather for the day. And I'm going to give them specific instructions. And this is the test to see how much they're going to trust me. If they can follow my instructions, I know that they're trusting me. That was a profound act of grace. And notice that he doesn't give them a stockpile for a week. Just enough for today. You know why? Because trust is a daily practice. God knows these people. He knows that if they have enough food, if they store up a bunch of food, they're going to start relying on their supply rather than on trusting him. By providing just enough for that day, he's teaching them to depend on him moment by moment. One next right step after another. And that's a lesson that is still so relevant for us today because, again, we want security, we want and there's nothing wrong with long-term planning. I think there's some wisdom in that. But we not only want to know that things are going to work out, we want God to show us every little detail about how those things are going to work out. We want to know everything before we take that first step, but God doesn't, most of the time, doesn't work that way. He invites us to trust him one step at a time. The question is, are we going to stay surrendered enough that we can trust that he's going to provide every step along the way? Or are we going to be like the Israelites and grumble and long for the past rather than trust God with our future? We need to trust God today, knowing that he'll provide for tomorrow. That's the lesson that the Israelites are learning here. They couldn't gather more food than they needed. If they tried to store up the extra, it spoiled. And that's exactly what happened. When they tried to hold on to yesterday's manna, it rotted and stunk. And one of the funniest things to me, and I think I've said this before, I always like to throw this comment in, you know that the literal meaning of manna is, what is it? Because there's this stuff falling from heaven. What is it? I find that maybe funnier than some of you do. That's fine. It could also be a statement, what it is, which sounds as funny as what is it? It's whatever it's whatever God needs it to be for his people in that moment. That's what manna means. But they couldn't gather any more than they needed for that day, and God was training them to rely on them for their most basic needs. And isn't that the core of faith? Learning to lean on God, not just when things are easy, but especially when things are difficult. And I know it sounds kind of funny to say this, but I think sometimes some of us have an easier time trusting God with the big things than we do the basics. But God calls us to trust him in everything. That's why Jesus teaches us to pray. Give us today our daily bread. Let us trust you for the most basic things that we need. And that's just a reminder of how intimately connected and interested in your life God is. He cares about the things that nobody else would ever care about in your life. God cares about. And that's what he's training the Israelites to live like. Every morning they had to go out and gather what they needed for that day. Not tomorrow, not next week, just today. And in that process, they're slowly and sometimes painfully learning to trust. And we face the same kind of test in our lives. We don't have manna falling from heaven, but we have manna that we need to trust God for every day. Maybe it's trusting God with our finances. Maybe it's trusting God with our health, with our relationships, or just our future. But the principle is still the same. God often doesn't give us a long-term supply of answers or resources because he wants us to trust him daily, trusting that he is going to give us what we need when we need it. The challenge is, are we going to gather the manna that he provides, or are we going to keep looking back at Egypt, wishing we could just go back to at least we knew what we were getting? We fast forward to Jesus' time and we see this same lesson that Jesus is, all these years later, they're still needing to learn this lesson. In Matthew 6, he addresses the issue of trust. Right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, as he's laying out what a surrendered life to God looks like, a life surrendered to God looks like, and a life that he himself models, he says this. So let me tell you, don't worry about your life. Easy for Jesus to say. What to eat, what to drink, don't worry about your body, what to wear. There's more to life than food. There's more to the body than a suit of clothes. Have a good look at the birds in the sky. They don't plant seeds. They don't bring in the harvest. They don't store things in barns. And your Father in heaven feeds them. Think how different you are from them. Jesus hits us with a challenge right off the bat. Don't worry about your life. It's easier said than done sometimes, right? Because worry is practically built into our DNA. We stress about everything under the sun. But it's not that Jesus tells us to just stop worrying and then just doesn't give us anything else to go on. He gives us a reason that we don't have to worry. He says, look at the birds. It was windy. The birds aren't smart enough to fly with the wind. You see birds just hovering in the wind. They're trying to, and they're not really all, if you're a bird lover, I'm sorry, Birds are not that smart. That's why God has to take care of them. But look at, they don't labor, they don't plant, they don't, they harvest, they'll pick your seeds out of the ground, but they don't store away food in barns, and yet God provides everything for them. Aren't you more valuable than birds? Jesus is reminding us of something so simple and yet so profound. If God provides for them, won't he surely provide for you? Besides, as Jesus says, worry does not add a single positive thing to your life. It just steals your peace and drains your energy. Worry is a heavy burden to carry. It's exhausting. And yet we cling to it because it gives us the illusion of control. But Jesus invites us into something better. He calls us to trade our anxiety for trust. And again, he doesn't leave us empty-handed, and he gives us all sorts of reasons why that's a good decision. He doesn't just ask us to trust blindly. He points to tangible evidence in creation. If God takes care of the birds, won't he take care of us? And if that's not enough, he points to the flowers. In the next verses, objects that are much more passive than birds. I mean, flowers don't do they literally don't do anything. And yet, look how beautiful they are. They look that way because God makes them look that way. In other words, if God cares enough to clothe the flowers with beauty, doesn't he care that much more for you? Won't he provide for you as well? And not just physically, but in everything that we need, spiritually, emotionally, mentally. If God cares for something as fleeting as flowers, how much more does he care for us, his children who were created in his image? Jesus is urging us to see that God's care for us is both extravagant and unfailing. And his provision isn't just about meeting our basic needs. It's about caring for every detail of our lives, even the things that we ourselves might consider small and insignificant. But here's the pivotal moment in Jesus' teaching, because he's not just saying, don't worry, he's inviting us to shift our priorities. Because in verse 33, he really puts the button on this. He says, seek the kingdom of God above all else and live righteously, and he will give you everything you need. He calls us to seek his kingdom above everything else and then let God take care of the rest. That's the heart of this message. Instead of putting all of our energy into worrying about all of these other things, we're called to focus on seeking God's kingdom above all of these other things. Which means that our primary focus should not be on, as important as they are, should not be on our material needs, but on God's will and purpose for our lives and the rest of the world. When we prioritize God's kingdom, his rule, his values, his mission in the world, everything else falls into place. And Jesus is inviting to trust that as we make God's work and his glory our primary concerns, he's going to take care of he'll take care of everything else. And again, this isn't a decision that we have to make one time. It is a daily choice. It's a constant realignment of our priorities. So what is it right now that's weighing on you? What worry and anxiety are you carrying? Jesus invites us to surrender those things, to stop holding so tightly to those things and to trust that God's got you. Surrender and trust. If there's one or two other verses in Scripture that sum up this whole idea, it's Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart Do not depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all you do, and he will show you which path to take. That trusting God with all your heart means letting go. Not just of the easy things, but all of the hard stuff. It means believing that even when life doesn't make sense, God is good and he is wise and he's faithful. That even when we can't see the whole picture, he is leading you somewhere beautiful. And that's hard because we love to lean on our own wisdom, our own understanding, on what we can see and comprehend, which is one of the crazy things about humanity. No matter how often our wisdom and understanding lets us down, we just run right back to it. That's the definition of insanity. Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. But Proverbs reminds us our understanding is limited. God's isn't. When we release our grip and we seek his will instead of our own, he promises to direct our path. He promises to show us what path to take. That's trust in action. And along with showing us that path is an invitation to walk it. Trusting God with our ashes like we did last week. And you'll notice the baskets are up here again. And so this is an open-ended invitation between now and Easter. And if we can keep it going. That if there's something that you know that God is calling you to let go of, write it down. Put it in the basket and take some ashes. As a reminder, this belongs to God. And there may be some of us, we need to write that same thing down 2 or 3 times. Just to remind us, no, this is God's. That first decision is important, but it's not we have to keep making the decision to keep our hands off what we have given to God. It's waking up every morning and saying, God, I know you brought me out of slavery to those ashes, but they were so familiar to me. It's hard because I don't have all the answers, but I know that I need to trust that you do. And you know what? I can guarantee you this. God will honor that prayer. It's about choosing to believe that he is working in the mess, in the uncertainty, in the broken places, that he has a purpose, that he didn't bring you to the wilderness to abandon you, but you do need to learn to trust. And it's believing that when we surrender our ashes, our fears, our failures, our doubts, he trades them for beauty, for new life. So as we continue this path to the cross, we need to take this journey of trust seriously. That we need to continue to surrender what we've already let go. And trust that God is doing something bigger than we can even begin to imagine. We need to trust that step by step, he's making all things new, including you. Amen. Would you pray with me?